So, welcome to the Rock Your Lab YouTube channel. In this channel, or in this podcast series, we bring novel science from the academy to you. My name is Professor Okun. I'm a neuroscientist here at Bar Ilan University, and with us today is Dr. Salomon. Pleasure to be here with you. Rui has exciting science that he's doing here in the lab, and today we will hear all about it. So, Rui, I'm really curious to hear what is the fundamental philosophical question that you are trying, with the help of your students and in the lab, to answer.
Okay. So first of all, I love these big philosophical questions. When I started off, my PhD was on consciousness. And when I studied consciousness, I was looking at, and I thought that basically there are two pieces to this puzzle. One is, why are we aware of some things and not aware of other things? And during all that, there's another very central process which consciousness has kind of veered away with. The fact that there always has to be someone who's having this experience. So if consciousness is about having an experience, there is what the experience is right now. I'm seeing you, I'm hearing what I'm saying. But there's also an organism in the background, some self, a subjective self, who has these experiences. Okay, so there's two parts. One is what we call consciousness, or the contents of consciousness, or perceptual consciousness, and the other part is what we call self-consciousness, or subjectivity. And the first main thing I've been studying over the past 15 years or so is this sense of self, the sense of subjectivity. How does it come around in the mind and in the brain?
So the sense of self is the sensation of controlling our own actions, our own thoughts. Is that a good definition of
so I'd say
sense of self?
No, I think the sense of self, one of the problems with the sense of self is that it has many different layers. Okay, so we have many different kinds of selves, and this has been always confusing. At the level of the human psychology and psyche, the construct of the self is probably the most central thing we have. Right? We wake up in the morning and we think about me and I and what's happening to me. Our memories are organized in relation to the self. Okay? And this self has many different layers. Okay? So when we talk about the self, it's very important to define what kind of self are we talking about.
So for the sake of our discussion today, can you focus us on the kind of definition that, or layer of self that you will refer to?
Sure. So first of all, I'll just give a few examples to see what we're talking about. So for instance, there is one layer of the self which is the bodily self, and most of my work has been on that. How come I have a feeling that this is me? Okay, and this, of course, pertains to old questions about mind and matter, obviously. But when I wake up in the morning, this part of the world I care about the most. I feel that this is my body. Okay? But in reality, this is actually a part of the brain and a model in the brain which encodes this as my body. And this trick is very, very subtle, because in philosophy we call this something which is transparent. I have no feeling of the processing needed to make this body feel that it's me. So it seems to me that that's just the way the world is.
It's like under the hood, you're not aware of it.
Exactly, it's just under the hood. So in philosophy they call this transparency. And what this means is that while we feel that we're always in our body and this is the way things just are, this isn't true. And we see deficits in that from people who have brain damage. Okay? People who have brain damage, often after stroke, for instance, they wake up in the hospital bed and they come out and they say, well, I'm feeling okay, but this isn't my arm. This arm does not belong to me. This is a condition called somatoparaphrenia. And when you look at that, all of a sudden you start to understand that it's just a very, very strong system, but it's still a computation the brain does to bring our psychology, psyche, mind, soul, you name it, and form it into an integral part with our body. This is a computation the brain does, and it relies on certain circuits and certain computations to be able to do this, and they can be damaged, for instance, during stroke or different disease.
So when you say circuits, you mean that certain brain regions are connected or interconnected between themselves and enable this kind of computation that the brain does, right? Do we know these brain regions?
So we know some of them, and it's a very interesting discussion on how this actually comes to be. Today, the idea, one of the strongest ideas, is what we call predictive coding. It's the idea of how the brain works. And this idea, the main function of the brain is tied to predict what's going on in the world. Okay, so when you think about a baby, They just come out in the world. And they don't have the sense of self yet. It's something which has to be developed. But what happens?
How do you know that?
It's an interesting question, but first of all, you can kind of see they're quite fuzzy. But we also know that several processes which require, for instance, multisensory integration are not fully formed at the beginning. Okay? And I'll give some examples. When they come out, they don't know how to bring things together. This is something you have to learn. You have to learn, for instance, that when you move your hand, it's also going to appear in your visual field. Okay? Or if you touch yourself, you're going to feel it here and here. Okay? And this is what babies do at the beginning. They move around, they do all these movements. And what slowly emerges is that the brain, in an implicit manner, starts to learn that things happen together. So when I touch myself here, I feel it here and I feel it here, and it's also related to a movement I've done, a neural signal going to the motor system saying, move and do this. Okay? And when the brain learns, after a while, that these are very consistent, they always happen together, these things, it starts to build a model. This is kind of model representation. And this first very basic representation is what we call the bodily self. Without this bodily self, you cannot function in the world very well because, for instance, babies very quickly learn to bring something to their mouth and open their mouth at the right time. This is important for you to survive.
So it seems to me that the basis for this sense of self is a combination or a list of associations that we do.
Sure. I think they start to arise from bodily signals. So what the brain is doing, it's looking at the bodily signals, at the tactile, proprioceptive, vestibular, visual sensations, and trying to find rules. What happens between all these? Okay? Now, the cool thing about the self is that you have a lot of insider information, right? The world, and we'll talk about what happens in the world, how we model that later. But for the self, when I make a movement, I know that I'm going to make this movement. So I have insider information from my brain that what's going to happen now is probably related to what I just did. Okay? And indeed, for instance, one of the reasons that we cannot tickle ourselves, why is that? Because when I come to tickle myself, my brain is predicting that this is going to happen, and therefore it has no effect. So we know that for the consequences of our own actions, when I touch myself, it feels less strong than if you would touch me with the same pressure. Okay? Because this I can predict. So we're downplaying these sensations because they all belong to the same model. I'm less interested in my leg touching my leg. But if a snake moves over my foot, I have to be very aware of that. So after a while, the brain takes all these associations and builds a kind of a model and says, well, you know what, this is me, I know, I'm expecting this. And as long as these things happen as expected, this model is intact. And this is the basic model of the bodily self, which is implicit in what we call pre-reflexive. You don't have to work at it, it's just there. Okay? And this is the beginning, this is the bedrock formation of the sense of self, which later can turn into more complex things, social self, narrative self, other levels.
Is there a way to quantify the sense of self? Are we on a continuum of self-awareness?
Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that most of the stuff we're talking about now does not rely, it's implicit. Doesn't rely on how you feel, what you're thinking about. It's not a reflexive level of the self. This all happens within the bodily mechanisms, and it's automatic. We don't have control over most of these things. So we all have all kinds of measurements that we do. How much you tickle yourself is one. But for instance, we can also see when you touch yourself, or when I press a button and hear a sound. If I'm pressing this button, the sound will sound not as loud. But also we can see the neural processing in the brain will be diminished compared to the same sound which I did not make. And if you press my finger to press a button to make the sound, again, I'll have a stronger representation. Okay? And if you think of this in the idea of predictive coding, or trying to explain the world, if I do something and something happens and I can predict that, okay, I'm kind of in my safe zone. This is what I've expected. The brain is not worried about these things. The brain worries about things which are unpredictable, maybe dangerous, or important to learn. Okay? So this is kind of a trying to model this. And these are things we can measure experimentally. For instance, schizophrenia patients who have problems with the sense of self, they can tickle themselves. And they have diminished a reduction of neural responses for self-generated actions.
So this is indeed a way to measure sense of self, the ability to tickle yourself, or is it just something that you tell me because I don't know how to...
No, so I'm saying, first of all, within the sense of self, this is what we call the sense of agency. It's one aspect of the bodily self, okay? So we have these different levels, okay? And within that, we have different measures, neural and behavioral, to see how much you have this, okay? For instance, in my...
I must ask you, I'm sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm gonna do it a lot. So, we differ between ourselves in many aspects. For example, our ability to focus our attention. And another thing is we differ in our ability to sense, physically sense, the sense of touch. So these two aspects of attention and our, it can be the density of receptors on our skin that sense, touch and everything. Those two aspects can affect our sense of self, if I understand you correctly.
So attention does not matter so much for this, because as I said before, it's pre-reflexive. You don't need attention. If we needed attention to have a sense of self, this would be pretty bad. Because you have to say, okay, I'm me. At this basic bodily level, it's just there. You don't have to use attention at all. The level of sensitivity in your perceptual could be important. And definitely if there's a big change. And I think one very good example, which kind of exemplifies what you're saying, is if you have your hand amputated, or if you lose a hand, okay, you don't have a hand anymore. But almost all of them still have a sensation of having a phantom hand. So there's still a representation of this hand, which is related to the brain's internal model of what the body should be like. And it stays there. And what bothers them the most is it itches. They want to scratch this hand and they can't because it's not there. So I think this shows very strongly this is more a representation than the physical capacity. And even if you don't have these receptors anymore, even more maybe if you don't have proper inputs to these receptors, you can still have these sensations of having a body and control it even if it's not really there.
So this amazing example of amputees actually tells us or teaches us that the brain is not as flexible as we think it is, because this is a person lacks a whole limb, and the neural model, if we want to use that term, doesn't update itself in the brain.
That's a very good question and a very interesting one. So on one hand, we have different kind of illusions that we use to study the bodily self. Show that you can change, like the rubber hand illusion, where we take a rubber hand and we touch this rubber hand, and we touch your unseen real hand. And after a while, you're going to feel that this rubber hand is your own. So this on one hand shows that you can change this body representation quite quickly.
That there is flexibility.
There is flexibility, exactly.
So how do you reconcile these two?
And I think that's a good thing, because you might get pregnant and have a different kind of body and you have to fix that, or maybe you're carrying something and you have to bring this into your body representation. On the other hand, amputees are a good example of how things don't change so quickly, okay? And this is not really surprising. So people who are born differently, and I've done a study with people who are born with 6 fingers, so they have a representation, that's fine. But if you suddenly lose something that you've been using for many years, and you have to remember there's also a lot of hardwired stuff there. So this hand is connected to this part of the brain with a wire, with a real wire, okay? These things don't go away so quickly. Okay, so there's some level of flexibility, which is good and important. On the other hand, some things become very hard-coded, and I think that's also good, because we don't want things to change too much. So if I'm carrying 2 bags, I don't want to have a continuous body representation of being that wide. When I drop the bags, I want to be me again.
This is a good explanation for why we want to be less flexible. So we need actually a balance, but do we know how long do these phantom limbs persist?
They typically persist forever.
So under specific conditions, our sense of self can be inflexible at all.
Sure, I think generally our sense of self is quite inflexible. Okay, I think it's very difficult for people to imagine not having a sense of bodily self. So there's a famous case of a patient who had some very rare virus which caused him to do deafferented. Deafferented means that he's not getting any signals from his body to his brain. Signals are going down, but they're not coming up. So he has no tactile sensation, no proprioceptive in the sense of where your body is. So this person woke up and his feeling was that he does not exist anymore.
We will put a link to this particular case in the description. This is extremely interesting.
And this person actually had to teach himself to walk again, because he doesn't walk now like you and me based on we know where our body is. Implicitly, he has to look at where his body is to know what's going on with it.
Wow.
So it's a completely different way of working. In a way, he treats himself as an object and not from inside as a subject so much, right? Yeah, so it's a kind of different level of representation.
How can we know whether that all of us have the same or similar sense of self? Are there any kind of pathologies that affect the sense of self?
Sure. So that's a very interesting and good question. So first of all, for your first part of the question, feeling different is normal. Okay, I think that's an important thing to know. Feeling different is very normal. People have all kinds of sensations about the self. And these things can happen, and they're usually not a sign of trouble. Sometimes it can be very small malfunction. Sometimes most of my work is based on causing these things to malfunction temporarily inside the laboratory, and then people leave and they're fine. Okay, so this is okay.
You hack into our senses in a way.
Completely, I try to hack into the sense of self in many different ways.
That's an amazing concept for me, because you don't know, but I work mostly with mice as my model of organism to study Alzheimer's and stuff related. And we cannot hack into these organisms in the same way that you can do with your human subjects.
So first of all, there are work in mice and in other non-human primates showing these kinds of effects in the brain.
Amazing.
Yeah, they have some very interesting work, because you can, of course, do different, if you work with animals, you can do different things that we cannot do in humans. It's more difficult sometimes to quantify the experience, yeah, but they're very, very elegant pieces of work showing directly which parts of the brain are involved in this. Regarding the pathologies of the self, so we have different pathologies regarding the bodily self. One of them we've mentioned, somatoparaphrenia, waking up and saying, well, this is not my hand or not my arm. There's also pathologies on the sense of agency. For instance, in the alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome is people who have brain damage. They sometimes, it's a rare condition, lose the sense of controlling their hand. Okay? So if you've seen Stanley Kubrick in How I Stopped Being Afraid and Learned to Love the Bomb, you can see there's this Nazi scientist, okay, who has this kind of alien hand syndrome, and he lost control of his hand. So typically what we see in hospitals is a very strange behavior. It's as if there are two people in there. So one side, the person is conscious and he's talking to you and he seems reasonable, and then he has one hand, for instance, opening his dress, and the other hand is closing. Okay?
Wow, that's amazing.
So you lose control, and this brings up a very interesting question. Who's controlling the other part, right? Who's in charge there? So these are quite rare, but this shows a clear deficiency in the sense of aging, in the sense of controlling your own actions. That being said, there's all kinds. So even like in normal people, so if you go to the doctor and he knocks on your knee and you get the reflex, you don't have agency for that. You didn't cause that. He caused that, right? So this also kind of shows a normal loss of agency for your own body. Okay. Then we have, for instance, in psychosis and schizophrenia, there's a very strong loss of the sense of agency. Okay? And this is a big subject that we've been studying a lot. Okay, this relation between how I feel I control my actions and how well I can predict them, okay, and psychosis.
Do all schizophrenic patients have alteration in their sense of agency?
All the ones I've tested do. So,
okay. And what is the prevalence of schizophrenia in the population?
So schizophrenia is highly prevalent. We're talking about between 1% and 2% worldwide. Okay, often, most typical, it's an early onset disease during teens. So in males, it's between 13 and 21. This is a typical age of onset. And the outcome is very, very bad. So the prognosis is not very good. We're getting better in many things, but the prognosis is not good. These people typically have to live a difficult life, and it's not something we know how to solve not by any surgery, and the medications we give are very limited in their impact.
Is lifespan affected in these individuals?
We lose many of them to suicide and also other comorbidities, but generally they can live a very long life.
So 1 to 2% of the population, that's a lot of people worldwide. So to me, it means that this very research of sense of self and sense of agency and the pathologies that relate to it, schizophrenia chiefly amongst them, is very important, very translatable, and it brings me a question. Can you use the kind of analysis that you do in the lab as a biomarker for pathologies such as schizophrenia?
So people are not going to believe we didn't discuss this before, but we just we're publishing an article now in which what we did, we tested sense of agency in schizophrenia.
I'm asking the right questions.
You have an instinct for it. So we have a kind of a virtual hand illusion. So you have a virtual hand on a screen, your hand is below, and you make a movement. Okay, and we make slight alterations to this movement. For instance, you move the finger, and we show you the same finger moving, but delayed by 200 milliseconds, by a fifth of a second. Okay? And then we ask you, well, did this hand move like you moved? Okay, so in a way we're testing your sensitivity to see how well you can predict what's going on with your body, your sense of how, and what are the limitations of the self. So healthy people, healthy controls, after 200 milliseconds, they typically say, well, that wasn't me. Okay? On the other hand, schizophrenia patients, even at 300 and 400 milliseconds, typically say that this was them. Okay?
Oh, that's useful.
It's very useful, and even using only a set of about 30 trials, which takes like 5 minutes, we can already classify at 85 to 90% if this is a schizophrenia patient or not a schizophrenia patient. So this will not replace, of course, psychiatrists and psychologists who actually work with this. This can maybe give a way to test kind of a cognitive marker in people, and maybe even we can see if this is a precursor. We've done some work with people who are kind of high risk for schizophrenia because they have a genetic mutation called 22q11. It's a genetic mutation which gives you, instead of 1% chance, a 30% chance of having a schizophrenia. But these people are fine. But even in this population, who are non-psychotic, we already saw that they have deficits of agency. Now, there's also some logic to this, because what we see in psychosis and schizophrenia are that they have hallucinations, especially auditory hallucinations. Now, the strange thing about auditory hallucinations is they're not random. What people typically hear is they hear someone kind of talking to them, saying, well, you should have done that. Often it's a very kind of critical voice. Now, I don't know about you, but me, I also have an internal voice, right?
All the time.
All the time, saying, oh, I should have done that, I forgot to do that, let's have coffee. But if you don't remember that this voice is actually you, and you feel it's not part of your internal model, then it becomes an auditory hallucination. Okay? So this problem with agency and this problem with delineating the self, saying what's me and what's not me, is a very central part of schizophrenia. They also have sensations that other people are controlling their thoughts and actions. Okay, so you and me, for instance, I don't know, if a bird flies by here, so we said, okay, a bird flew by. Often for psychosis patients, they take this as something deeply important for themselves. And they say, well, I controlled that bird, or that bird was controlling me. Okay, so this problem of having the sense of control can then translate and become a difficulty in knowing where the boundaries of the self are. And then stuff is coming out, and stuff is also coming in, which should stay outside.
So in this respect, you mentioned that there are specific brain regions that are part of the circuitry or brain circuitry that is involved in our ability to perform this sense of self. Okay? And on the other hand, you say that there are schizophrenic patients that have an abnormal sense of self, and you can actually measure it. So the question is there a way to surgically intervene or sort of touch the brain region in which is affected and sort of correct it, or at least reduce the prevalence of these abnormalities?
That's an excellent question. And the way we're looking at it now is we think, especially in schizophrenia, that there's not unlike, for instance, a lesion. Okay, so when there's some brain damage due to stroke in a certain region, the problem with schizophrenia is probably diffused. So it happens over many regions. So it's not something we can go to one area and fix or take out. It's not like a tumor or a specific damage. It happens in many, and it affects the way we process information. In a way, the fact that these feelings they have are not random, what I think is happening is the brain is still trying to predict and give meaning to things, but it's doing it in the wrong way. So the weighting that it gives different things is wrong. Okay? So, for instance, if you're not able to predict if this is your movement or not, and you see something happening, how do you know if you caused that or not? So the world becomes a very confusing place to live in.
So the short answer to my question is that it's not possible because the problem, if we can say, is a sort of distributed in several brain regions, and we can't really touch on all of them.
Exactly. I would even venture and say that it's more at the chemical level of the brain, and it's related to neurotransmitters across multiple regions. So it's not a problem in the cerebellum or in the frontal cortex or something which is very focal.
Well, that makes it more complex to treat. So it brings me another question. Now that we have, for example, in the publication that you're about to send, is this tool that you developed going to help us develop treatments?
So I really hope so. But I'm very careful with this kind of thing. I'm, first of all, very modest about our science. We have to show this, that it works before we can say. It's something that we're aiming towards. We're trying to see maybe we can kind of train you. Maybe there's a way to train people to better differentiate, okay, or even just to know. So one other level we're looking at is how do you know if you have a problem in recognizing yourself or not? So if you know, so for instance, I know, if you're drunk, you're a bad driver. Drive badly, right? But you need to know that you're drunk to know that this is not a good time to drive. So this is something we call metacognition. And we're very interested in if we can maybe improve through training, more cognitive training than actually brain training, because this is where, and see maybe you can kind of nudge people to have better outcomes. But this is something we're just starting on, and we're not sure yet. So
this is a sort of a very popular concept in cognitive treatment, etc. But myself, coming from a more biological aspect or field or school of thought, I immediately think, well, if you have a tool that gives you an output that is measurable in milliseconds, as you say, perhaps I can take or screen for drugs that were perhaps never even used before to see whether some of them sort of reduce this abnormality. Are these kind of strategies being used?
So this is exactly something we've started to do now in a psychiatric hospital near here. What we're doing is instead of just testing people once, we're testing psychosis patients several times throughout their hospitalization. So they come in, they have kind of very severe case of psychosis, and typically with medication, and they often change medications they tried, they improve until they're released back to go home. So we're testing them several times, and we're trying to see if this measure of sensitive agency can predict whether the medications are working, if this is the right medication for the person, if they track their clinical status, and then maybe you can also know when they have to come back and change their medications even when they're at home. So we're trying to kind of translate this tool into something which can support psychiatrists in the prognosis and the treatment of schizophrenia. Once again, we don't have very, very good drugs for schizophrenia. Okay, so it's not like a perfect solution that it kind of is tailor-made.
But to me, it's very exciting to know that there are attempts, and actually successful attempts, to develop tools that will quantify the condition. And I think it's a step towards developing therapies. Well, we discussed about sense of agency, okay, and how you can actually manipulate it in the lab, which is so cool. Can we feel sense of agency towards the other, towards someone that is, whatever, either dear to us or the opposite? Is it possible? Is it known?
So that's an interesting question. If we go back there's an excellent example for it. So when we go back to how the sense of agency is actually built, what's happening is when I make an action, and I'm not a baby anymore, so when I do this, I expect to hear something, and I expect to see something. The outcomes of my actions are well predicted by my brain, right? This has been hijacked in the social world by two groups, okay? One is the military, okay? So why does militaries across the world use marching in tandem, okay? One of the reasons for doing this is when I make an action, but I see this action happening in other people exactly at the same time, there's a diffusion of this sense of agency and sense of self. This creates group coherence. So both in the military and in churches and religious establishments where people sing together and move together, this kind of joint agency is used to create social cohesion. Okay? So if you and I start doing something together, okay, at the same, so actually you're mirroring what I'm doing. So I'm giving a signal to my hand to move, and you're doing the same thing. This instantly creates kind of a link between us, because in a way I'm feeling agency over your actions and you're feeling over mine. And this brings us closer together. And we also know this even in social interactions. We nod together, we do several things together, which kind of brings us closer. For instance, romantic couples, they have this mirroring of each other's actions, which is more strong than if you're just meeting one of your mates at the pub.
Humans typically congregate in small groups, then larger groups, etc. Perhaps the developing sense of agency, not just towards myself, but also to the others, was part of our ability to survive as a species.
Completely, and I would say this is we've been doing some work along with Ruth Feldman at the IDC, where we're looking at interactions between mothers and infants, for instance. Okay, so for me, what happens, and the synchrony. So, when mothers, they look at the infants, they kind of synchronize, they have the synchrony going on.
Well, we need to explain what synchrony is.
Okay, so synchrony is just this. When I'm looking now at you, okay, and we're nodding together, we're creating some kind of social link here, right? So if I'm nod at you, then something's wrong here, right? Or if I'm looking at my phone, this is a very typical thing, looking at your phone, okay? So when humans link together, we have some synchrony going on. You can see this in pupil dilation and how we take turns speaking or moving our heads, okay?
So it's a behavioral synchrony.
It's a behavioral synchrony, yeah. It's a behavioral synchrony. And to me, this is an extension. So we said when you're a baby, you have to learn that this kind of internal model of the self, right? So you learn that when you send a certain signal, this happens. And then you learn to predict that. And in a way, we're using the same kind of synchronies to get social relationships. So you're taught by your mother, by your caregivers, how to do these kind of synchronous relationships, when to nod, how if I smile, you smile, and we get this kind of reciprocal behaviors that show that we're linked somehow, right? And then you kind of use this in larger and larger groups in the world. We recently published a big paper about the synchrony.
Okay.
And what we did is we had people go into the fMRI, and they had to imagine themselves in all kinds of situations, social situations, okay, happy, sad, and put themselves kind of in the situation, okay? And what we found is that the amount of synchrony that we collected over 20 years during their childhood, during their adolescence, so we saw their synchrony with their parents, actually predicted the neural representations of empathy when they were older. Okay? So having the synchrony, having the right amount of synchrony with your parents in an early age can really impact how well empathy is about being able to have these representations of another person within you, but also keeping them separate. So if you don't grow up in the right way, and you don't have normal synchronous relationships, this can impact how well you can represent other people's feelings as an adult.
And that's how you link it to the sense of agency towards the other.
So we wouldn't call it your sense of agency, it's more kind of synchronizing with other people. Yeah.
So we know that different organisms, or at least my understanding is that they perceive reality differently from other organisms. For example, insects can perceive the environment also through ultraviolet vision. Bats can perceive the environment through echolocation, so sensing the surrounding using sounds. Some birds can sense the Earth's magnetic field and navigate according to that. And we, as humans, mostly are limited to the spectrum of visible light. So different organisms perceive reality differently. So it was shaped by evolution in a way. So in that respect, and I think that in this kind of direction we go towards another field of interest of your lab, how do we know what is real, what is reality?
So this is a tremendous question. And I got into it quite a bit after spending time during my psychiatry research. So if you spend a day like this with a schizophrenia patient, so they're experiencing things that I'm not experiencing. But if it's only you and them in the room, you don't know who's actually right. And for them, these experiences are as real as your experiences. So what makes your experiences real and theirs not? And when I left at the end of the day from the psychiatric hospital, there's a disturbing feeling about not being really so sure about this, okay? About what's real and what's not real. And this brings up a super interesting question. Since what we experience is what we experience, how do we know if it's real or not? Okay? And we don't. This is the first thing we have to accept. We have no idea what's really out there. All we know is the information our senses bring us. Okay? So this is a very typical kind of kids question, right? One of the first philosophical questions kids say, so what if my green is your red? How are we ever going to know this? Right? And we don't. Okay? So I think one of the important things to understand is what's really out there is something we don't know. What's happening, and this is exciting, is our brain is constructing a reality. The world probably doesn't look like this at all. Okay? Our sense organs and our brain are constructing something which is good for our survival, as you said. Okay? So Donald Hoffman from California, he even says that this is probably the wrong way to go about is think that what we sense is anywhere near reality. What we experience is probably related to what's important for us to survive. Okay? And he gives this idea, so if you have a folder on your computer screen, right? Okay? This is it's a symbol. If you open the computer, you're not going to find this folder anywhere. Okay? In the same way, when we're looking at something and seeing, and color is a good example. Color is not really there. Color is here. Right? There's no color out there. There's electromagnetic fields, right? And radiation in different wavelengths. We build color and shape and meaning. This is something our brain does, probably to give us better chances of survival. But to me, this is like an amazing thing. Okay, we're in the matrix, and the matrix is this hallucination, which we call reality, which our brain builds for us.
This has many or several parallels with astrophysics. For example, you can use the telescope to look at a faraway galaxy, or even the Milky Way galaxy, and then you have a different telescope that uses or looks at a different wavelength, and it sees a completely different picture, or provides you a different picture, which is also only part of what maybe is real.
So which of them is real? Is that one real? Is that one real? Are they both real? So what's really out there?
I guess it's all part of reality that we may get a glimpse at, but we will probably never know what is the entire
Sure. So this is
reality.
classic Spinoza, right? Spinoza said that we're only seeing different parts of reality. We're built to see, and maybe other organisms are built to experience other parts of reality. And maybe there's no such one reality out there. I mean, this is also a question what's really out there that we're experiencing. But we'll never know that. We can only know kind of what we're experiencing. So that being said, I'm not like a nihilist, okay? So if I am standing on a roof, I'm not going to jump. I believe that something will happen if I jump off a roof. Okay, if a car is coming, I move out of the way. Okay, so, I mean, there's a philosophical side, there's a very practical side. I think there is some correspondence, which is learned and important, between what I'm experiencing and things in the world. I'm just saying that what we see and feel and think that this is orange and this is a glass and this is, you have a black shirt, these are not real in a kind of an objective way. This is what our brain is building for us because it's helpful for us to experience the world.
We need to trust it because it helped bring us over here all the way through evolution. So in a way, we need to trust it, but we need also to develop this trust in our senses to sense reality.
Sure. So this is the interesting part, and we really, really, really trust our senses. Okay. For instance, the sense of reality is a major criterion for mental and neural health, right? So one of the first things, if you come to the hospital and say you hit your head, they're going to do what we call a reality check. Do you know who you are, where you are, are you responding? Okay. And the thing is that while we're using this kind of sense of reality as a criterion, we don't really have any neural and phenomenological definition for what it is. So in this project that we're working on now in the lab, what we want to do is test how the brain decides what is reality and what's not. Okay? How do you know that this voice in your head, it's not real in the sense that there's really someone there, but it's real in the sense that you're sensing it in a way, right? Okay? So how do you know? And this is very, very important. For instance, in schizophrenia patients, we know that some of them have these hallucinations, which are not real in the sense that there's no real sound there, and they know they're hallucinations. We call this insight. Okay? They have insight. They know it's a hallucination. While others hear this and think that it's real. And the patients with insight have a much, much better prognosis. The chance of getting better is much, much higher. So being able to differentiate between real and not real, having the sense of reality, okay, is very, very important for us. Okay? It's a very important skill to have. Now that being said, it's also, for instance, a 6-year-old who has an imaginary friend and maybe even really believes in an imaginary, that's fine. A 16-year-old with the same imaginary friend will probably be hospitalized. So there's something that develops here, okay? And what we think is developing is actually a model, in the same way that we build a model of the self, we start building a model of the world. What is to be expected of the world? What's reasonable, okay? So if now a polar bear will walk into this room, this is going to be outside our experience, okay? And we're going to say, okay, maybe we're hallucinating. That's an option. There's a zoo nearby. Maybe it escaped from the zoo, okay? But we're going to have to explain this in some way. And there are two ways to explain this. One saying it's not real, and one is changing our model of what can be. Now, maybe if we're working in Antarctica, actually polar bears are in the north. In the North Pole, maybe it's normal for polar bears to walk in, right? And then this is part of our model of reality. So what we're doing in this project is we're actually trying to test different models of reality and seeing how much for different aspects of what's real, how tight our model is.
How do you do that?
So what we're doing, we're creating virtual hallucinations. We use virtual reality, and we built a very, very realistic virtual reality environment. So you're walking, and it looks like a room kind of like this. And then what we do, we start perturbing different aspects. So for instance, we can play around with gravity. Okay? So for instance, what happens if
gravity?
Yeah, because in virtual reality we can do this. What happens if gravity goes wrong? So we have people like throwing a ball and trying to hit something with this ball, and then all of a sudden the ball does not use the typical rules of gravity that we've learned our whole life. So I don't know, maybe you play basketball, maybe you throw stones and stuff. We have an expectation how this is supposed to work. What happens when that's not working? What regions of the brain light up? When do you start feeling this doesn't make sense?
But this is kind of a very practical question because, humankind has ventured to space for decades now, and the sensation of going to zero gravity is actually a reality nowadays. And people think to colonize Mars that has a different gravity. So it's not like something that is something that has to do only with the academy and some philosophical questions. That's a really down-to-earth question. I think NASA should be part of it.
If they want to fund it, they're very welcome to fund it. Some of these are real-world questions about how we can adjust, and we obviously adjust. Not only that, sometimes we like these things. The reason that people watch science fiction movies is they want to see stuff which is kind of outside our normal reality. It makes it interesting for us to these rules bent a little bit, right? Magicians do this. We love these things. Roller coasters do this. They kind of change our level of expectation, okay?
So how good is technology today to provide us with tools such as virtual reality, goggles, etc.? How good is it nowadays to enable us to fool ourselves?
Okay. So I work a lot with virtual reality, and I've been working for years, and we're getting much, much better. Obviously, you know that this is not reality. And for me, that's a good thing right now, because they would never let me do these experiments if people Okay, if we could really fool people completely.
That's a good point.
Okay, like ethically, we could not do this. Okay, so this virtual reality. What I like about virtual reality, there's agreement there. You put on this headset, and it's like going into a movie. It's a simulation, and you know when you go into a movie, you might scream, you might get very afraid and scream, or laugh or cry, but you know it's a simulation. You know these are actors, and you're not going to die, and it's going to be okay. Okay, in the same way, virtual reality allows us to do a simulation using exactly the same rules that we build reality. Okay, we do this, we use visual and sensory motor cues and bring them together, and it creates a very realistic sense of reality. So if you have a virtual cliff in virtual reality, people don't want to fall off it. And if you bring a knife to the virtual body, they get afraid. They draw back. You can get the GSR responses which are typical fear responses. So we know that people kind of buy into this illusion because it's a very powerful illusion. And then yet they don't think it's the real thing. There's a new technology called augmented reality, or AR. And AR, what it does is it takes the real environment and kind of adds things on it. Okay? It's not as evolved as virtual reality yet, but this is going to be something which is going to be more problematic, I think, in the sense of the brain. Because it's one thing to have this agreement putting on a virtual reality headset and seeing strange stuff, but if all of a sudden a monster would come out of a real wall, then this is exactly challenging the sense of reality, because the wall is real. So and is the monster real?
Yeah, the example you gave earlier for the polar bear that enters, that can be achieved with an augmented reality?
Currently, it would not look so good. But I'll give you kind of a more mundane but also dystopic example. So you're wearing these augmented reality glasses, okay? And a very attractive woman goes like this, come over here, okay? And tries to bring you into a store. Now, how do you know if she's a commercial or not? Okay? And we're not far from going there, okay? Or a dog comes and barks at you, and maybe you're afraid, and pushes you towards a certain cafe. Okay, when these things mix together, it's going to get very confusing. And one of the reasons we're really looking at this project now is we think that down the line, technologically, a few years from now, we're going to have serious challenges to the sense of reality. And this is time to really understand the neural underpinnings of the system, because it's going to get challenged more and more. You have to remember that 30 years ago, if you saw a picture, you said this was the truth, and the video would definitely be the truth, right? And now all of a sudden we have to recover from generations, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, that our sense data is no longer correct. Okay? We're used to having this, taking it as reality. Even just the ability to manipulate images and fake video and stuff like this has caused a lot of confusion about what's real. So you see a picture of someone doing something, that used to be a strong signal that this really happened. And now we say, well, no, it's been manipulated, it's not real. Okay? We really, really trust the data that falls in our senses. And once you start fooling it, it's practical for experiments, but it can be very dangerous if you don't know when it's real and when it's not. So we've also been thinking on ways maybe to kind of mark things as real or not. Okay? Maybe you want to know of the many things you're seeing which are commercials, and you have to mark them.
How will you do that?
So there are many ways of doing that. I think even now we're doing it in all kinds of ways, right? So sometimes at the top of the page they say, okay, this was promoted by someone, so you know it's not as real as maybe the next thing, right? It's the next news item. Because you have that small thing saying it's different. So visually we could do this in all kinds of ways. We could make it gray, like instead of color, have it, and then you say, okay, this is not, that dog is real and this dog is not real. That's important to know, walking down the street. But there are a lot of questions to answer, and this is one of the reasons we're really going into studying the sense of reality, understanding what it means. Because it's a tricky thing. I'll give you, from the other side, like in our dreams, okay? In our dreams, really, really strange things happen, but we believe them to be real. So our sense of reality is kind of gone to sleep there, right? So we're experiencing strange stuff. I can be a different person or something, and okay, that's fine. I mean, I can live with that.
So the sense of reality, how do you tackle this topic in your lab? What kind of experiments do you run?
So, as I said, what we do is we use this virtual hallucination approach. We take people, we do very clear psychophysics, we make measurements of how sensitive they are, and then what we do is we bring them into this room, into this environment, and they have to do tasks there, and we change this stuff. And sometimes all the stuff we change is very subtle. So we're really interested, not obviously if there's no gravity and everything is crazy, it's crazy. What happens if it's just noticeable, or just barely noticeable, or not noticeable? Okay? Because indeed, in the first stages of derealization, depersonalization, psychosis, where you're getting these strange sensations, it doesn't start off from a full-blown hallucination. People typically say that something strange is happening. They can't quite put their finger on it. So we're kind of interested in this place, this uncanny sensation. Something seems to be a little bit wrong. And then maybe people don't know it's wrong, and then we can see what's happening in the brain. So we're recording EEG, which is electrodes on the scalp. And we do this also in fMRI. And we're also recording a lot of physiological measurements, how people's heart works, their eye movements, and pupillometry, how their pupils dilate. So we're taking a lot of neuro and physiological measurements, try to build a profile of what happens when things don't seem real to you.
Wow. Any findings that you can share with us? Or that it's still work in progress?
So it's still work in progress, but we've already seen some interesting things. For instance, one of the things we do is kind of an Alice in Wonderland thing, okay? So in virtual reality, it's very easy to make you bigger or make you smaller, okay? And we found two interesting things through this Alice in Wonderland manipulation. One thing is that you are much more sensitive when people make you bigger than smaller, okay? And this
compared to what?
To make you smaller. So if I make you larger or smaller, you are more sensitive when you become larger than when you're smaller. And this makes a lot of sense to us because our theory says that your sense of reality is based on your experience. And we have much more experience about sitting down, lying down, than we have becoming larger, which only happens when you go on a ladder or something like this, okay? So we can see this it's kind of the same manipulation. You're either getting bigger or smaller, but smaller you're okay with. Bigger feels strange to you very quickly. And people who are not sensitive, who don't notice this change in becoming bigger or smaller so well. Some people notice it very well. Some people don't notice it well. This is correlated to prodromal symptoms of psychosis. So if you don't notice these changes of the sense of self, actually, okay, you're already showing kind of prodromal symptoms of psychosis. But this is something we have to replicate and we have to look in more deeply. We also have several experiments in which we use psychoactive compounds that can kind of change what you're sensing, like ketamine. And we're interested in really building kind of a neural and pharmacological model of how you decide if something is real or not.
So we spoke about our ability to sense reality. And we sense reality, we as humans, sense reality as, using our senses that are available to us. What will happen if we add additional senses to ourselves? For example, if we add sensors that can detect infrared radiation and then hook it into our brain using electrodes. Or, additional senses. How do you think it will affect our ability to sense and interpret reality?
Okay, so I think in a way the brain is very flexible to these kinds of things. I mean, there are all kinds of new informations that we're integrating. The problem is the way we sense the world is through the very specific sensors that we have. Okay, so I mean, you can. There's been a study in which people are given a belt which pulls towards the north. So it's a compass built in a belt, and it always tells you. But you're going through tactile receptors, and you're basically teaching tactile receptors to do something else as well, which is the same thing we do when you learn Braille, right? You're teaching tactile receptors to take in letters and words, okay? And our sensory systems are very flexible towards these things. They like to learn these new challenges. If you'd hook this up directly into the brain, that's very interesting, because how would this be represented? How can you represent data for which you don't have a sensorium? Okay, what would this look like? So it's very easy for us to imagine infrared, because if we take it and say, well, I see a certain spectrum, and now I'll see a different spectrum. We can translate it into a different color or whatever. But how can you sense something that you can't sense? We have no vocabulary for this, right?
For example, magnetic fields, to actually sense them.
But how would you sense them? I mean, if you can feel them pulling you, then this is a certain sensation. Can you see them? Okay, I mean, we can show thermal activity. You can put on goggles and see thermal activity. So this is not, but we're just translating it into vision. We have no way of imagining, okay, sensations for which we don't sense. That being said, there's another part of my research that we haven't discussed at all, which is related to sensing the inner parts of the body, what we call interoception. Okay? So there's a lot of information within our self-model which comes from the heart, the lungs, the guts. Okay? We don't typically really feel them explicitly. Okay? But they're giving a lot of signals which impact our brain. They're very important for us. If your heart's not beating, this is important for you to know. So there's a lot of this information. We're not aware of it, unless it becomes very, very important. For instance, if I'm running and my heart is beating very strongly, I'm going beyond my capacity, and then I feel my heartbeat. Typically, we don't feel these things, but they do impact our cognition and decision-making and feeling in many, many ways that we're not explicitly aware of. Okay? So sometimes maybe if you say, okay, having a gut feeling could actually be the expression of many different important signals that we don't have a way of saying, well, I saw it, I thought it, I heard it. Okay? So maybe this kind of signals that are trying to tell you something, but you don't know how to name them, right?
You know, we spoke about pathologies that affect our sense of reality. Are there, compounds that we can take, or compounds that have been known in the culture to affect our sense of reality?
Sure, of course. So I think what we're kind of talking about is what we call psychedelic compounds. This is the word that we now use for this. And there are many classes of compounds what we call psychoactive. They impact they impact our brain and mind. Yeah? Of these psychedelics, which means mind manifesting, which is an interesting name, are compounds which impact how we experience the world. And they do this in two very interesting ways. First of all, they're very dependent on who you are, what you bring with you. This is what we call set, your personality, your previous experiences. And they're also very dependent on the setting, where you're experiencing this, what is happening around you, or in a quiet, in a favorable environment, or you're experiencing something scary. So they're very impacted by this. But what they typically do, no matter where they are, is they create hallucinations. And these hallucinations have some rules to them which are interesting. Okay? It's not each person hallucinates something completely different. There are kind of typical things, geometric patterns which appear.
Interesting.
Okay? So for instance, kind of a waviness. So you can kind of see waviness in the world, or a kind of the geometric matrices which run over everything. And the other two important things, one is that they create a sensation of meaning. Okay, what's what we call noetic quality. You feel that things have a meaning, that they're important, that they're interesting, and that you understand some deep meaning of things. And the final, very typical thing is strong changes in the sense of self. Okay, so for me as a scientist studying consciousness and self and reality, this is obviously a very interesting venue, and this is something we're slowly going into. It's now going, it used to be illegal. Now their doors are opening to use psychedelics to study different things. In many countries you can already use this in scientific studies. And for me, this changes in the sense of self are very interesting, because we said before that we probably have this sense of self. It helps us to do stuff in the world. It's very practical to differentiate between me and the world, right? Then I can walk and do stuff. And under psychedelics, this thing becomes more diffuse. So all of a sudden, the boundary between yourself and the world are very different. So maybe you can feel that you are a tree, or the tree is you, and you're not sure who's who anymore. And this is very interesting, because it's kind of a rare opportunity to take off these glasses that you've been wearing all your life and see things differently. Okay? And the crazy thing about psychedelics is that even though you're seeing everything very differently and really, really weird in a way, your feeling is that you're actually seeing the truth. Okay? So you have a strong sensation of, whoa, this is really strange. But on the other hand, you feel this is the first time I'm seeing the truth, actually.
So this shakes the ground beneath our confidence in what is reality.
Completely. And in a way, I mean, Aldous Huxley suggested this in the doors of perception. He said that basically what psychedelics do, they're cleaning the doors of perception. If we go back to what we discussed about what the brain is actually doing, the brain is trying to structure, okay, our experience. Okay? So there's a question, does the wall really look like this? Or maybe the wall really is wavy. Okay? And maybe what happens under psychedelics are kind of disturbing our predictions, which help us create a very normalized and stable perception of the world. And actually, maybe what we're seeing more of the world as it really is. Okay? We know that our perceptual senses and the predictive coding scheme cause us to experience certain things in the world which we think are more likely, and to exclude the polar bear and the strange stuff, right? The brain is saying, well, that can't be real. So the brain likes the kind of this good story about what seems to make sense. And maybe these psychedelics are changing things up by connecting different regions of the brain. This is what we know what happens under psychedelics, and causing us to see things differently. And then the question is this differently a hallucination, meaning it's less real, whatever that means, or maybe we're actually getting a glimpse of what is actually there, minus our predictions about the world, minus the work the brain is doing to make everything kind of look clean and shiny and normal.
So what is our ability as scientists to study psychedelics?
Mm-hmm. So it's tricky in a way. First of all, it's tricky because it depends on set and setting. So if you take someone and give him LSD and put him inside an fMRI magnet, he's going to have a very different experience than someone who's sitting outside in the grass. And this is very tough for science to study stuff which changes depending on where you do it and how you do it, right? We can look at what's happening inside the brain, which is interesting. Okay, we have a lot of more and more data collected about what's happening in the brain, what's connecting differently, what regions are more active and what's less active. For instance, we know that certain regions related to the sense of self, especially the sense of narrative self, I am Roy Solomon, actually their connectiveness is decreased. And indeed, under psychedelics, you feel less connected to your name, to your kind of history, to who you are, and more connected to the world at large. Okay? So it's a very interesting tool. We can kind of connect between different phenomenological aspects of psychedelic experience, which are very strong, to different changes in the brain.
It seems to me that whereas during our infancy, in order to develop that sense of self, we build associations between things. We mentioned it earlier. And when you use psychedelics, you sort of lose these associations, to lose the border between yourself and this table or a tree. I can think about many things that are more dissociated than that example. So it seems to me like the opposite of what we undergo during our development.
Exactly, and there are people who are making exactly, for instance, Alison Gopnik is making exactly this claim. We're going into a more kind of childish appreciation of the world. So if you have no expectation about what's in the world, you're kind of seeing it more as it is, because you're learning. You're learning what happens in the world. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, because an old dog already expects what to do, and you only see it one way. And you can often see this kind of rigidity in people who are older and maybe less flexible to look at things in new ways. And one of the ideas is that psychedelics changes around in a way allowing us to shed temporarily some of these rigid predictions that we make and actually experience things in a more flexible manner and maybe more realistically or more how they are, and not through the prism of our experience and the way we expect the world to be.
So in that respect, for example, the phantom limbs that we mentioned earlier as being a manifestation of inflexibility of the mind, perhaps the use of psychedelics can actually ease that inflexibility for these individuals and help them sort of lose that sensation of a limb that they no longer have for years and years.
That's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, theoretically, it follows this logic of kind of allowing more flexibility and allowing changes. We know that there's proven, clinically proven studies that show that for depression, which is one of the things is kind of this rumination and this rigidity, this difficulty to think about things in new ways, can get stuck in a rut. So psychedelics, psilocybin specifically, is very effective, and this is related to how much you feel that you're kind of leaving yourself and opening up and feeling part of something larger than yourself. Okay, so this kind of change in the sense of self, which is part of the psychedelic experience, is predictive of how much this will help people get rid of their depression. And one session of psilocybin is very effective. It's like taking 5 weeks of typical antidepressant medicine. Okay? So it's one thing that happens, and it's very, very powerful.
How easy is it for a scientist to study using or to use psychedelics for his own studies? Is it commercially available? Can I decide tomorrow that I want to study psychedelics and go ahead and do that?
So, sure, in rats you can.
In rats you can. In animals you can do it.
Yeah, so you're still going to have difficulty getting some of these compounds. In humans, so now it's coming, but it used to be legal, and most of them, for instance, LSD is very, very safe. I mean, toxicity is very, very low. Aspirin is much more dangerous toxicity-wise than LSD. Now it's coming back. So right now we're doing studies only with clinical populations to see clinical efficacy. But we're hoping, and this is already done in the UK, and it's done in the US, and in many places in the world, that we can also work with control healthy populations to see how this works on the healthy mind.
So that kind of studies is being done to test.
Being done in the UK extensively, in the UK and in the Netherlands, in the US, in many places, it's already being done. And in Switzerland, it's been done continuously. Okay? And they're very interesting results. And I think overall, it's also not so dangerous. I think in these settings where you screen the people and you control the environment, there's not so much danger in psychedelics. Okay? It's not like, taking anyone or going to a party or stuff like this. They screen people, there are people taking care of you, supporting you, making sure that everything goes well. So the dangers are very, very small.
And is this a trend that studying psychedelics is becoming more and more prevalent worldwide?
Completely. It's a huge thing now with many, many studies worldwide. This door is being opened again. I think the important thing is to do it very responsibly. So we already went through this once in the 50s and 60s, and that ended badly. Also because on the scientist side, they were too much impacted by what they wanted to see. I think Timothy Lear is a very, very good example. Took it too far and not careful enough. We have to do very, very good science. This is not a magic bullet. It does not solve everything. And on the other hand, it's not a demon. Okay, it's a very strong compound that teaches a lot about how our brain and mind work. And there are a lot of potentials in that. It just has to be done scientifically and responsibly.
So you mentioned it briefly, but what actually happened that sort of stopped studying or stopped the study of psychedelics?
So a lot of this is actually political. During the 60s in the United States, LSD was associated with liberal thinking, left-wing hippies. Nixon decided that Timothy Leary, who's a Harvard professor, called him the most dangerous person in the United States, right? Put the FBI to chase him down.
The most dangerous.
In the 60s, during the Vietnam War. So this is obviously a very political thing. And then in the US, they were classified as drugs that are not even available to study within medicine and science. I'm not saying that they should be legalized and sold on the street. I'm saying, so then, in Switzerland, they've been continuously studied. But now I think that people have understood this was a political issue. And now kind of cooler heads have prevailed. And we're saying, okay, let's use this where it's helpful and study it. And where it's dangerous. And there are some dangerous compounds out there. Alcohol being a much more dangerous compound, right? Take this carefully.
What is alcohol? No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So when are we expected to see some psychedelic studies here in the lab?
So now it's all done within psychiatric hospitals, because right now we're using clinical populations. They'll probably not be done here in the lab. They'll probably still be done in medical centers because
even healthy individuals.
Even healthy individuals will probably do this in medical centers first, just to be on the safe side. It's controlled. We're going to start a study now with healthy individuals using ketamine, which is also a psychoactive substance, but not a classic psychedelic. And using the virtual reality stuff that I discussed before to see how ketamine changes the sense of reality.
Suppose psychedelics were as freely available as alcohol in society. How do you envision its effect on society?
It would not be a good idea to have people buying LSD in gas stations, right? This is not a good idea. And same for alcohol, right? It's also a bad idea to have people buying vodka in gas stations and going on continuing driving. So I think society would be a better place if people experience these things carefully and in a controlled and responsible manner.
So it's interesting. You say on one hand, you think it will have a beneficial effect. You didn't say what will be the beneficial, but you say that overall you feel that it will be. But on the other hand, you feel that it shouldn't be completely freely available on every corner, etc.
Yeah, because I think these are the kinds of things you have to do in a responsible way, in the right setting, maybe some screening. So in a way, we're kind of selling, the only thing you do need to get alcohol is to be of a certain age. Maybe that's not such a good idea. I think alcohol, many people use it responsibly and enjoy it in a great way, and it's a fantastic sensation, right? Other people abuse it and use it in a very bad way and do very bad things, okay? And in a way, I think psychedelics, we have the opportunity to do this in a better way, and maybe they shouldn't be on sale everywhere, okay? But on the other hand, places which have legalized psychedelics, for instance, in the Netherlands and now in the US and Colorado, they're legal. We're not seeing a change for the worse in crime. Okay, and I'll give you an example from your world. LSD is not addictive in animals. Animals will not take LSD again and again, unlike alcohol or cocaine, which they do. These substances are not addictive in that sense. They create a strong sensation, but you don't want more and more and more and more and more.
What do you think conceptually? I mean, for example, food. There is no limitation on what kind of food you can, take. Some foods are known to be bad for you. Some are very good. But it's up to you whether to ingest a particular food, take a specific diet, etc. It's almost the same with smoking. Almost the same with alcohol. So over there, I guess age is the only limitation that we have. Do you think that psychedelics should be the same, sort of there will be a specific limitation, and otherwise people can take it and possibly harm themselves, but it's a free country, so... Mm-hmm.
So it's a good question, and you mentioned food and smoking and alcohol, and I think these are the three leading causes of death in the West: obesity, cancer. Okay, these are things that people obviously are not so good at policing themselves well, right? I think actually psychedelics are not as bad as, smoking is clearly very addictive, alcohol is very addictive, eating we have a problem with kind of maintaining the right.
It's also addictive.
Okay. Psychedelics are much less addictive than all of these, so it's less of a problem. You know what? I think that at the end, you'd want people to have, and this is the way it was typically done. So psychedelics have been used in shamanic societies for many, many, many years. And then it was part of a ritual and part of your life. And you wouldn't take it in the morning and go watch a movie or you'd take it as part of a meaningful ceremony by someone who has experience, together with your community, with an intention of changing something in yourself. Healing was often an intention, or bringing the community together. So it was part of something which had meaning. And this is very, very different. And the same thing happens. So if you drink alcohol as part of a ceremony which has meaning, it's very different than sitting alone at home and having too many beers.
It's interesting to think about the link between the shamanic use of psychedelics and the synchronization in society, that I link it to what we discussed about the sense of agency to the other, etc. It might be an interesting link. Roy, we are really in the end of our conversation, so I really want to thank you. I for a long time, I really wanted to have a thorough discussion with you about the topics that you study in your lab. Your lab is a sort of your lab is a shrine for many enthusiastic young aspiring scientists, and it's wonderful to see it. And thank you for the opportunity to hear about the science and actually the deep philosophical questions that are interesting you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure, and thank you. And thank you all. And if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the discussion. Till next time.